The rain came down in sheets on Route 9 that Tuesday evening, the kind of rain that doesn't apologize, the kind that pounds the asphalt until the highway looks like a river, and the yellow lines disappear entirely beneath a mirror of black water. It was the kind of night where most people slow down, grip their steering wheels a little tighter, and pray that everyone else on the road is doing the same. Not everyone was. There is a quality to certain kinds of rain, not the gentle, cinematic kind that arrives in a mist and softens the edges of everything, but the relentless, operational kind that comes in off the water with an agenda, the kind that doesn't so much fall as attack. It had been raining like that on Route 9 since 5 o'clock, and by 6:30 the highway had become something that tested every assumption a driver held about their vehicle, their reflexes, and their luck. Dispatchers across 3 counties had already logged an above-average evening for fender benders. This was not a fender bender. The first impact happened at 6:42 p.m. A white pickup, overcorrecting after hydroplaning, clipped the rear quarter panel of a silver Honda Accord doing 55 in the right lane. The Accord spun. The pickup jackknifed. The grey Nissan behind both of them had less than half a second to react before it became the third vehicle in a chain of wreckage that would eventually block all 3 lanes of northbound Route 9. Just outside of Millhaven County, steam rose from crumpled hoods. Glass scattered across the highway like diamonds. One car had its engine pushed back almost to the firewall. Another had rolled onto its side, the passenger window now serving as its floor. People stopped. Some pulled over immediately. Some kept driving because that's what fear does. It tells you that if you just keep moving, it isn't your problem. Isaiah Perkins was not the kind of man who kept moving. He was 41 years old, though he looked 35 in the way that certain men do when they have spent their adult lives in physical discipline and outdoor conditions. Not young exactly, but built to last. He stood 6'2" on an ordinary day and carried himself with the contained, deliberate energy of someone who has spent a long time in environments where deliberate means something, where every gesture costs exactly as much as it needs to and no more. There is a phrase, economy of motion, that gets used about athletes and sometimes about soldiers, but what it really describes is the specific quality of movement that belongs to someone who understands, in a very concrete way, that wasted energy can be the difference between success and failure, between life and something else. That was Isaiah, in a grey t-shirt, in a parking lane on Route 9. In the rain, he had been heading home from a 14-hour day, still wearing the same grey t-shirt he had put on before dawn, the cotton damp at the collar from a long day of work that had started before the sun came up and apparently intended to end the same way. He drove a black SUV, practical, unremarkable, the kind of vehicle chosen by someone who doesn't need anyone to know what he does for a living. He pulled over before he had consciously decided to. Some training is that deep. He was out of his vehicle in 4 seconds. He scanned a scene the way you scan for threats. Methodically, quickly, without panic, because panic is a luxury that costs lives. The overturned Nissan had a man inside who appeared conscious and was moving. Good. The white pickup had deployed its airbags. The driver was already stumbling out on his own power. Good. Then Isaiah's eyes went to the silver Accord. The driver, a woman, mid-40s, wearing a blue cardigan, was still inside. The door on her side had caved inward slightly from the impact, which meant her door wasn't the way in. The passenger window was cracked but not shattered. Isaiah got his elbow through it in one controlled strike, cleared the glass methodically and reached inside. She was conscious, that was the first thing. Conscious. But her neck, the angle of it, the way she was sitting, the way her head had tracked against the headrest during the spin, all of it told him what he needed to know before he touched her. "Ma'am, my name is Isaiah. I'm trained in emergency medicine. I need you to stay very still for me. Can you do that?" Her eyes found his. Scared, but present. "Yes," she whispered. "Good. That's good. Don't try to move your head. Don't try to nod. Just talk to me with your voice." He had both hands on her cervical spine within the next 30 seconds. Steady. Deliberate. The kind of stillness that only comes from having done this in conditions most people will never experience. Desert temperatures over 110 degrees. Mountain terrain at night. Floodwater up to your chest. The added complication of incoming fire. A rainy highway in October was nothing. His hands did not shake. They never did. "You're going to be okay," he said, and he meant it the way a doctor means it. Not as a comforting lie, but as an assessment. The woman exhaled slowly. And then Officer Brett Harrison pulled up. Harrison was the kind of cop who treated every scene like his personal property. 15 years on the force of the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department. Not one commendation in all 15 of those years, which, when you know what he spent those 15 years doing, tells you everything about how a system can protect its own worst elements and call that stability. He had grown up in Millhaven, knew the streets, knew which families had money and which ones didn't, knew which names appeared in the paper for fundraising galas and which ones appeared in court records. He had joined the department at 22 with the specific understanding, absorbed from mentors he should never have had, that the badge was a kind of currency. Not a formal currency, nothing documented, but a currency nonetheless, a tool that, if deployed with enough confidence and enough regularity, would purchase a version of the world that worked in your favor. He had spent 15 years spending it. He was a large man, not imposing in the way that commands respect, but large the way a wall is large, something you run into rather than something you regard. He had a way of moving slowly and deliberately at scenes, not because he was calculating, but because he wanted everyone around him to understand that whatever was happening, it was happening at his pace now. He stepped out of his cruiser, surveyed the wreck, took in the bystanders, a few people on their phones, one man in a reflective vest who had set up flares on the road, the overturned Nissan in the distance. His eyes moved the way an owner's eyes move across a property he's inspecting after a storm. Then they landed on Isaiah Perkins, a black man in a gray t-shirt, crouched inside someone else's vehicle, hands on a woman's neck. Brett Harrison had already made up his mind before he took his first step. "Hey!" He walked toward the Accord at a deliberate pace, thumb hooked near his belt. "Hey, get back from the vehicle. Right now." Isaiah did not look up immediately. The cervical stabilization he was providing required complete concentration. Any sudden movement on his part transferred directly to the woman's spine. He knew this. He finished a mental count before responding. "Officer, I'm performing cervical stabilization on this woman. She has a potential spinal injury. If I release the pressure before a backboard is in place, she could sustain permanent paralysis or worse. I need approximately 2 to 3 more minutes until EMS arrives." Harrison stopped 2 feet from the car and crossed his arms. "I don't care what you think you're doing. I gave you a lawful order. Get back from the vehicle." "Sir, with respect, I am trained." I said, "Get back." Isaiah's jaw tightened, not with fear, with the specific, exquisitely controlled kind of restraint that a man exercises when he knows that losing control of the situation will cost someone else more than it costs him. He kept his hands where they were. "My name is Isaiah Perkins. I hold federal credentials and emergency medical training. I will show them to you the moment this woman is safely transferred to EMS care. But I cannot release her cervical spine, not while she is showing signs of, 'You got about 3 seconds to remove yourself from that vehicle before I make you.'" Now Isaiah looked up. Just briefly, he looked at Brett Harrison the way a man looks at a problem he has already solved. Not with anger, not with fear, but with a clarity that has moved well past both. "Then you'll have to make me," Isaiah said quietly, "because I'm not letting go." What happened next took less than 4 seconds. Harrison reached for his taser. The crack of the electrodes was sharp even over the driving rain, a sound like a small, vicious bolt of lightning compressed to arm's length. The probes hit Isaiah in the left side of his back, just below the shoulder blade, and 50,000 volts of electricity moved through a man who had been through 12 years of training specifically designed to break the human body in every way it can be broken, and then put it back together again. His hands went rigid, his whole body seized. And then Isaiah Perkins, 220 pounds of controlled force and institutional memory, hit the wet asphalt the way a mountain might choose to simply sit down. Not falling, dropping, with a weight and a finality that was almost dignified, even in the indignity of it. The smell of ozone mixed with rain and burning rubber and gasoline fumes. The woman in the silver Accord made a sound. Harrison stood over Isaiah. He looked down at him the way a man looks at something he's just concluded. Then he reached for his cuffs and knelt down, pulling Isaiah's arms behind his back with the mechanical efficiency of routine. Too tight. That was what Dunning would note in his report 6 weeks later. The cuffs had been applied 2 ratchets past department standard. Not an accident. Isaiah was barely conscious, semi-present, the way a man is when his nervous system has been forcibly interrupted and is in the process of rebooting. He turned his head just far enough to see something fall, his Navy SEAL challenge coin, the one he had carried for 11 years, the one pressed with the trident that represents something most people alive will never fully understand, slipped from his pocket as he was turned over. It landed in the mud 6 inches from his face. Harrison looked at it. He bent down. He picked it up with 2 fingers, the way you handle something you've already decided has no value, and he turned it over once. "Stolen valor garbage," he said. He dropped it back in the mud. Then he stood up, put his boot on it briefly as he shifted his weight, and walked back toward his cruiser. The 14th precinct of the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department sat on Granger Avenue like a building that was proud of itself. Brick facade. American flag above the entrance. A row of benches out front where, on ordinary days, ordinary people waited for ordinary bureaucratic resolutions to ordinary problems. This was not an ordinary night. Harrison walked Isaiah Perkins through the front entrance at 7:18 p.m., and he did it the way a man carries a trophy. Not the good, humble kind of trophy, the kind you earn on merit, but the kind you put on a shelf to remind yourself and everyone around you of something you did. He moved slowly through the room, catching eyes, letting people see. The desk officers looked up. A few nodded. One of them, a woman named Reyes, who had been on the force for 9 years and had never once filed a complaint, despite having cause to on at least 3 occasions, looked at the man in the gray t-shirt being walked through her precinct, the stillness of him, the controlled breathing, the way he moved even in handcuffs with a quiet, complete precision that suggested someone who had been in worse situations than this and had emerged from all of them, and she felt something she could not name settle uncomfortably in her chest. She looked back at her screen. Sergeant Donovan Miller was at the duty desk when Harrison came through. Miller was a 22-year veteran. He had seen a lot of things get walked through that door. He prided himself on being able to read situations quickly and accurately, which is why what he felt when he saw Isaiah Perkins, a feeling not unlike the sensation of stepping onto a surface that looks solid and discovering too late that it isn't, troubled him more than he was willing to admit. "Got a big one tonight, Miller." Harrison was grinning. Actually grinning. Guy was interfering at the accident scene out on Route 9. Started running his mouth about credentials. Federal this, federal that. Had one of those challenge coins. He gestured toward the evidence bag. "Stolen valor types. You know how it is." Miller looked at the evidence bag. He looked at the challenge coin inside it. Then he looked at Isaiah Perkins. "Get him booked," Miller said, because that was the path of least resistance, and Donovan Miller had been choosing the path of least resistance for 22 years, and every single time he had done it, he had told himself it was pragmatism. Isaiah was walked to interview room 3. The room was 8 feet by 10 feet. A metal table bolted to the floor. 2 chairs. A camera in the upper corner that Harrison had learned, over 15 years, to position himself out of. The air was stifling. The HVAC in this wing had been malfunctioning since February, and nobody had prioritized fixing it. The humidity pressed down like a physical weight. Harrison pulled the chair out across from Isaiah, turned it around, and sat with his arms resting on the back of it. The posture of a man who has settled in for the evening and is enjoying himself. Isaiah sat across from him. His hands were cuffed in front of him now. His gray t-shirt was wet through from the rain and dirty at the shoulder from the asphalt. There was a mark on his left forearm. From the taser probes, a reddish abrasion that would bruise into something ugly by morning. He sat with a posture that was, given everything, extraordinary. Back straight, feet flat on the floor, eyes level. He looked like a man waiting for a connecting flight. Mildly inconvenienced, entirely present. Harrison set the evidence bag on the table. The challenge coin was visible through the plastic. "So," Harrison said, "want to tell me who you really are? Or are we still doing the whole federal credentials performance?" Isaiah said nothing. "Because here's what I think." Harrison leaned back slightly, arms still on the chair. "I think you found that coin somewhere. I think you've done this before, shown up at scenes, played the hero, pulled the credentials card. I think you're a con." He tapped the evidence bag. "And I think this is a prop." He stood, walked to the small frosted window and looked at the parking lot for a moment, the posture of a man demonstrating he doesn't need to watch you to own the room. "You know what the worst part is? Guys like you. Come in here, run the speech. Federal credentials, Navy, whatever." He turned. "Out on that highway, in this county, I am the law. Not your clearance level, not your coin. Me." He came back to the table and leaned on it. "In here, you're nobody. You're a detainee in a gray shirt with a story." Isaiah looked at him, with the same level, calibrated calm that he had maintained throughout. The same calm that in a different room, a federal briefing, a combat debrief, a strategy session, would have marked him immediately as the most senior and most experienced person present. Harrison couldn't read it. He had spent 15 years learning to read people through intimidation, through the responses fear produced. Isaiah wasn't producing those responses. The absence of them made Harrison angrier in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Isaiah looked at the bag, then back at Harrison. "I'd like access to a secure line," he said. Harrison smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who has won something and wants the other person to know it. A secure line. He let that sit in the room for a moment. "This isn't the Pentagon, son. This is my precinct." He leaned forward. "There are no secure lines in my world. You're in my world now, boy." The word landed in the room. Harrison said it the way men like him say it. Not as a slip, not as carelessness, but as a deliberate deployment. A territorial marker, a reminder of what he believed the relative power positions in this room were and always would be. Isaiah looked at him for a long moment. His expression did not change. "Then I'll wait," he said. "You'll wait." Harrison laughed, short, dismissive. "Okay, you wait. You're going to be waiting a long time." He stood. "In the meantime, let me tell you what's going to happen. We're going to process you for obstruction of law enforcement, resisting arrest, and interference at an emergency scene. You're going to get a public defender, and a bad one, and you're going to take a plea deal, because the alternative is 6 months in county, and then you're going to go back to whatever it is you actually do for a living, and you're going to think very carefully about whether you want to do this again." He picked up the evidence bag, and that coin is going into property. If you can prove it's yours, actually prove it, maybe you get it back in 18 months. Isaiah said nothing. Harrison paused at the door. "I'd save myself the trouble and just let it go. Things like that," he gestured vaguely at the bag, "tend to get lost in the system." He left. Isaiah sat alone in interview room 3. He looked at the camera in the corner. He looked at the wall. He breathed slowly and evenly. He waited. Officer Danny Dunning had been on the force for 8 months. He was 26 years old, a native of Millhaven County, the son of a firefighter and a third-grade teacher. He had joined the department because he believed, genuinely, without irony, in a way that was increasingly hard to maintain in the environment he had found himself in, that the job meant something, that the badge was a commitment to something larger than yourself. He had come into this job with a specific mental image of what it would mean to wear that badge. He had imagined himself at accident scenes, keeping people calm, making difficult situations manageable. He had imagined himself as the person that a frightened child looked for in a crowded emergency. These are not naive imaginings. They are the correct imaginings. They are exactly what the job is supposed to be. 8 months had taught him a number of things that his training had not prepared him for. The casual dehumanization in the break room, the way certain officers spoke about certain parts of the county, the pressure, Never explicit, never documented, but always present, to resolve situations in particular ways that benefited particular people and penalized others. He had pushed back twice quietly, and had been quietly and efficiently informed that his probationary review was coming up, and that probationary reviews were influenced by our officer's ability to function as part of a team. He had not yet crossed any line that he could not come back from. Not yet. Tonight he was about to make a choice that would define the rest of his career. He ran the prints because it was procedure, because that was what you did, because whatever else was happening in this department on this particular night, the booking procedure required a print check. And Danny Dunning was still the kind of person who followed the procedure. He typed in the numbers. He waited. The system ran its query. He waited a little longer than he should have needed to. And then the screen changed. It wasn't a criminal record. It wasn't a service file. It wasn't even the kind of restricted federal record you occasionally saw for government contractors or security personnel. A grey-out, a referral number, a message to contact a specific agency. What appeared on Danny Dunning's screen in block letters, in a shade of red that he had never seen on this system or any other, was a message that felt less like a database return and more like a warning. Level 5 clearance. Do not detain. Contact Pentagon immediately. Subject Perkins Asaya. Federal Authority. Director Regional Emergencies. All detainment perseverance. Aldrissy. Meant to be sick within one. Hira Dunning stared at it. He looked around the room. No one was watching him. Reyes was on a call. The overnight sergeant was in the back. Harrison was in the interrogation wing, probably still congratulating himself. Dunning looked back at the screen. He thought about his probationary review. He thought about being a team player. He thought about the man in the grey t-shirt sitting in interview room 3 who had looked, when they walked him through the precinct, less like a man who had been caught doing something wrong, and more like a man who was waiting for everyone else to figure something out. He picked up the phone. The red line at the 14th precinct rang at 9:47 p.m. It was a phone that most of the personnel on duty had never heard ring in their careers. It sat on a dedicated console in Chief Gerald Dawson's office, not the duty desk, not the dispatch station, but his office, behind a closed door, on a shelf that had accumulated a light layer of dust on the receiver, because the last time it had actually been used was 3 years ago during a federal counter-terrorism coordination exercise, and everyone had half assumed it was a relic. It was not a relic. Dawson picked it up on the second ring because the sound of it had cut through the ambient noise of the precinct the way a fire alarm cuts through a crowded room. Not loud exactly, but impossible to mistake for anything else. "Dawson," he said. He listened. The voice on the other end of the line was the kind of voice that is rarely raised because it has never needed to be. The kind of voice that belongs to a man who has given orders in situations where the consequences of those orders were irreversible. Admiral Clarence Webb of the United States Navy spoke for approximately 90 seconds. He did not ask questions. He provided information and he provided instructions, and he did so with the efficiency of a man who is accustomed to being understood the first time. Halfway through the call, a second voice joined. FBI Special Agent in Charge David Morales, who had been patched in from a federal task force office 3 hours away and had apparently already been briefed. He spoke for 45 seconds. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds in total. Dawson came out of his office the color of old chalk. The skin around his collar had gone a grayish-white that made him look, to the desk officer who glanced up as he passed, like a man who has just received a medical result he was not expecting. He did not say anything. He went directly to the duty desk, pulled out the incident log, and stared at it for a moment as though hoping it would say something different than what it said. It said the same thing it had said before. At 7:19 p.m., Officer B. Harrison had booked one Isaiah J. Perkins on charges of obstruction, resisting arrest, and interference at an emergency scene. Dawson set the log down. 30 seconds later, 3 black Chevrolet Suburbans pulled into the parking lot of the 14th precinct. They did not pull in, they arrived. There is a difference. They moved with the controlled precision of a convoy that does this often enough that parking is a tactical exercise. and they positioned themselves in a triangle formation that covered the three primary exit angles from the building, as if this were, in some technical sense, a containment operation. Because it was. Special Agent Julian Holloway was first through the front door. He was in his early 40s, built like a man who still runs 6 miles every morning out of habit rather than necessity, and he moved through the lobby of the 14th precinct with the particular energy of someone who has been doing something extremely important for several hours and is now here to finish it. Behind him, a JAG Corps attorney in full dress uniform whose name was Lieutenant Commander Patricia Voss, who was carrying a leather briefcase and wearing an expression that said she had seen the file and had thoughts. Behind her, 2 federal marshals who positioned themselves near the entrance without being asked and without visible instruction. They simply knew where to stand. Holloway stopped at the duty desk. "I'm Special Agent Julian Holloway, FBI. I need Isaiah Perkins released immediately. I need every piece of recording equipment associated with tonight's incident secured, and I need the arresting officer in a room with me within the next 10 minutes. He placed his credentials on the desk. "Who's the ranking officer on duty?" Reyes reached for the intercom without saying a word. Sergeant Miller appeared from the back of the precinct and stopped when he saw the lobby. He had been a cop for 22 years. He had chosen the path of least resistance 100 times. He looked at Holloway, at the JAG attorney, at the 2 federal marshals, and felt the accumulated weight of every path of least resistance he had ever chosen arrive all at once. "I'll get him," Miller said. The hallway outside interview room 3 filled up in the 3 minutes it took to retrieve the keys. Word moves fast in a precinct when federal agents are standing in the lobby. Faster than official channels, faster than procedure. Officers found reasons to be in the corridor. Dunning, who had made the call that started all of this, stood near the far end of the hallway with his hands clasped in front of him, watching. Harrison appeared from the break room where he had been eating a sandwich and heard in rapid succession 3 different accounts of what was happening in the lobby, each one more alarming than the last. He walked to the corridor with the energy of a man who intends to assert himself, and arrived to find Holloway already at the door of interview room 3. "Who authorized this?" Harrison demanded. "Nobody called me. I'm the arresting officer. Whatever's happening here, I need to be consulted before." "You'll be consulted," Holloway said without turning around, "in approximately 8 minutes. In a room, with a JAG attorney present." The door to interview room 3 opened. Isaiah Perkins walked out. He walked with the same posture he had maintained throughout. Back straight, breathing even, eyes level. He was still in the gray t-shirt. Still damp, the mark from the taser probes was visible on his arm. He looked at Holloway, who gave him a brief nod. Then Dunning stepped forward. He was holding the evidence bag. He reached in, pulled out the Navy SEAL challenge coin, and held it out. He didn't make eye contact. He just held it out. Isaiah took it. He looked at it for a moment. The trident, the weight of it, 11 years of carried history, and put it in his pocket. And then he turned to Harrison. The hallway was full of people, officers who had found reasons to be there. The 2 federal marshals at the far end, Lieutenant Commander Voss, who was watching with a legal precision that would later manifest itself in 17 pages of documentation, Sergeant Miller, who had chosen 22 years of path of least resistance and was now standing at the end of every single one of those paths. Isaiah looked at Brett Harrison. Harrison's face had changed, whatever structure it had possessed earlier in the evening. The confidence, the ownership, the settled certainty of a man who believed in the absolute authority of his own position had been replaced by something altogether different. His skin had gone the color of old paper, not just pale. Depleted, as though something essential had been quietly removed and all that was left was the surface of the man. He knew. He had known from the moment the Suburbans pulled in. But standing here, looking at Isaiah Perkins standing free in the corridor of his own precinct, the full weight of what he had done arrived in his body with a physical specificity that was almost medical. He had tasered his boss. Not just a veteran, not just a federal employee, the newly appointed Regional Director of Emergency Services, the man whose office controlled the certification, the funding, and the operational oversight of every law enforcement agency in 3 counties, including the 14th precinct of the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department. The man who, by the authority of his position, could and would determine whether Brett Harrison ever wore a badge again. Harrison opened his mouth. He closed it. Isaiah Perkins looked at him. The calm was complete, absolute, the look of a man who has already run the calculation. "I didn't come here to start a war," Isaiah said. He paused. "I came to end one." The FBI investigation moved with the kind of speed that only happens when federal authority and documented cause align in exactly the same direction at exactly the same moment. Holloway had the warrants within 72 hours. The server seizure happened on a Thursday morning at 6 a.m. before the day shift arrived, before anyone in the department had the opportunity to do what people in departments like this one have historically done when they see what's coming. What they found on those servers was worse than anyone had officially expected. Which is worth pausing on because by that point a number of people had expected something quite bad. Harrison's file history alone covered 11 years of encounters that had never made it into official reports. Traffic stops with no documented resolution. Arrest records where seized property significantly exceeded logged evidence. Case files that had been altered in small, precise ways that were individually undetectable but collectively formed a pattern that a forensic accountant could read like a sentence. There were names in those files. A lot of names. Men and women who had been stopped, processed, charged, pressured, or simply robbed in plain sight by someone who understood that authority without accountability is simply theft with a uniform. And then there was the storage unit. Holloway's team found it through the financial forensics. A payment in Harrison's bank records, $12 a month for 12 years, to a self-storage facility on Route 14 called Safe Keep. Unit 7. A 10 by 20 room with a combination lock that Harrison had apparently believed was permanent. They called it the toy box. The term was Holloway's, coined during the initial walkthrough, and it stuck because it captured something that a purely clinical description could not: the specific quality of the curation involved. This was not a disorganized pile of stolen goods. This was organized, labeled in some cases, arranged with the care of a person who derived something from the arrangement itself, from the ownership of these things, from the ability to return to them and be reminded of each encounter they represented, which told you something about Brett Harrison that the HR files and the performance reviews and the 15 years of managed mediocrity did not. Inside were the accumulated remains of a decade of predatory policing. Personal property that had never been lobbed. Cash in amounts that told a complete story when aggregated. Items that, when cross-referenced against the names in Harrison's altered case files, matched individuals who had reported theft during their encounters with law enforcement and been told there was nothing on record. There was a watch in that storage unit that belonged to a man named Darnell Watkins, who had been stopped in 2019 and charged with a misdemeanor that was later dismissed. He had reported the watch missing. The report had been filed and closed without investigation. The watch had Harrison's fingerprints on it. There was a child's bicycle that had belonged to a family on Elm Street who had reported it stolen during a disputed traffic stop in 2017. The parents had assumed it had been taken off the street. It had been in Unit 7 of the Safekeep facility on Route 14 for 4 years. There was a leather-bound journal, a camera, a class ring, a brass nameplate that had been pried from a desk. Each item was its own story. Each item represented a person who'd been stopped, processed, charged, or released, and left without the thing they had arrived with. Each of those people had learned from that experience that reporting the theft would go nowhere. Most of them had been right. Until now, there were 34 items in that storage unit for which Holloway's team would eventually locate the original owners. 34 people whose property had been stolen not by a thief in the conventional sense, but by someone they were supposed to be able to trust with everything, including their safety. The dashcam footage came from Isaiah's own vehicle. He drove a black SUV with a forward and rear-facing dashcam system, 4K resolution, wide-angle, continuous recording to an encrypted cloud backup. The camera had been running from the moment he pulled over on Route 9. It had captured everything. The arrival. The assessment. The positioning of his hands. The officer's approach. The exchange. The deployment of the taser. The fall. The handcuffing. Harrison's hands on the challenge coin. The word he had spoken over the evidence bag. The audio was clear. The rain had not been loud enough to obscure Harrison's voice, because Harrison had not been speaking quietly. He had been speaking with the confidence of a man who did not believe anyone was listening. The footage also captured what happened inside the Silver Accord during the 4 seconds of Isaiah's taser deployment. It captured the sounds the woman made, and it captured the 11-minute gap between Harrison's arrival and the eventual handoff to EMS, 11 minutes during which the woman in the Silver Accord received no cervical stabilization, that, doctors would later testify, had worsened her injury in ways that required a surgical intervention that would not have been necessary otherwise. That detail became the child endangerment charge. Holloway watched the footage 3 times before he filed. Then he watched it a 4th time. Not because he needed to, but because some things require bearing witness. The trial was held in the federal courthouse on Archer Street. Judge Evelyn Carter presided. She was 61 years old, had been on the federal bench for 19 years, and ran her courtroom with a precision that tolerated no theatrics and no delay. She had seen cases like this before, not cases identical to this one. This one had particular details that were distinct, but she had seen the shape of it. The familiar architecture of institutional corruption protected by institutional silence, until something or someone finally punctured it, and she had seen what happened to the communities that held those institutions and were told, year after year, that this was just the way things worked. She had also seen what happened when those communities were finally believed, the specific quality of relief that moves through a room when a thing that has been denied for a long time is finally named and acknowledged. She intended to be very clear about the naming and acknowledging. Harrison's attorney, a private defense lawyer named Kessler who had built a career on exactly this kind of case, made his opening argument with the confidence of a man who believes that the framing of a story matters more than its content. He argued the weight of split-second decisions in the field. He argued the limitations of context. He argued that Harrison had seen a man in a car with his hands on a woman's neck in a crisis situation and had made a judgment call under pressure, and that judgment calls under pressure are the nature of law enforcement and cannot be evaluated retroactively with the luxury of full information. He was good. He was practiced. He was the kind of attorney who understood that juries respond to reasonable doubt, and that reasonable doubt can be constructed from uncertainty the way a building is constructed from materials, carefully, methodically, piece by piece. Judge Carter let him finish. The prosecution played the footage. 4 minutes and 32 seconds of 4K resolution on a screen large enough for the full jury to see clearly. No commentary during the playing, just the footage, the rain, the accident scene, Isaiah's hands, Harrison's arrival, the exchange, the crack of the taser, the fall, the cuffs, the coin in the mud, and then Harrison's voice, clear over the ambient sound of the storm, saying what he said. Kessler's argument did not survive the audio. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. The speed of that deliberation told you everything that needed to be told about what the footage had communicated. They returned a verdict on all counts. When Judge Carter delivered the sentence, the courtroom was quiet in the particular way that courtrooms become quiet when something definitive is about to happen. Not silent, exactly, but attentive in a way that feels almost physical, present. The families of several of Harrison's victims were in the gallery. They had been there every day of the trial. They sat now without moving, waiting. She looked at Harrison over her reading glasses. "You were given authority," she said. "Authority to protect. Authority to serve. You used it instead as a weapon against the very people that authority was designed to shield. You spent 15 years treating your badge as a license. It was not a license. It was a trust. And you violated that trust in ways that this court has documented at considerable length, and which of course considerable, documented, lasting harm to a significant number of people who had every right to expect better from you." She set down her pen. "Brett Harrison, this court sentences you to 58 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The charges include aggravated assault, child endangerment, racketeering, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations under the federal statutes. This sentence is intended to reflect both the severity of your individual actions and the systemic harm that those actions represent." She looked at him one more time. A badge is a shield for the public, not a sword for the wearer. The gavel came down. In the gallery, a woman in the third row put her hand over her mouth. She was Darnell Watkins' mother. She had been waiting 9 years for this room to say something true. Garfield Correctional Facility sat about 40 miles outside of Millhaven County, which meant that Harrison's commute to his new life was a little over an hour by transport van, cuffed at the wrist and ankle, wearing the same orange intake jumpsuit as every other person in that vehicle. The processing took 4 hours. Fingerprinting, photographs, property inventory, which in Harrison's case was brief, because the property he had accumulated over 15 years of service had already been catalogued by a federal evidence team and was currently the subject of multiple civil restitution proceedings. The officer who processed him was young, professional. He did his job without commentary because that is what professionalism looks like when you have decided that your job is to perform a function rather than to derive identity from it. He handed Harrison his bedding and his assignment slip. Wing B. The Long Hall. The Long Hall was what the inmates called it. It was a corridor that ran the full length of the facility's general population wing, 140 yards of concrete and fluorescent light, and the accumulated weight of every sentence that had ever been served inside it. You could feel its history as you walked it, not metaphorically, physically, in the acoustics, in the way the air felt heavier than it should. Most new arrivals to Wing B found the long hall disorienting in the way that all institutionally consistent spaces are disorienting. The sameness, the fluorescence, the specific register of ambient sound produced by a building where the walls are concrete and the population is close-quartered and the ordinary textures of outside life have been stripped away. Most new arrivals kept their eyes straight ahead and moved quickly and tried to be small. Harrison had spent 15 years making other people feel small. He did not know how to be small himself. He walked the long hall the way he walked every space he had ever occupied, with the posture of a man who expects to be seen, with the assumption that he was the most consequential person in any given room. He made it 12 steps before he recognized the first face. Marcus Webb. Stopped by Harrison in 2016, charged with resisting arrest. 6 months in county, 3 years of probation. The charge had been based on evidence that Harrison had manufactured. Halloway's investigation had established this in the 67th page of the federal report. Marcus Webb looked at Brett Harrison from the left side of the corridor. He didn't say anything, he just looked, with a stillness that Harrison recognized because he had seen it recently, in a gray t-shirt, in an interrogation room where he had said, "I am the law in this town." And the man across from him had simply said, "Then I'll wait." And Harrison had mistaken that stillness for defeat. He understood now that he had been reading the room wrong for 15 years. Harrison kept walking. Step 17, another face. Step 23, another. By the time he reached the end of the long hall, he had counted 9 faces that he recognized. 9 people he had stopped, charged, convicted, or otherwise processed through the machinery of a system that he had corrupted for 15 years, who were here because of decisions he had made, or because of lies he had told, or because of evidence he had placed or removed. They all looked at him with the same stillness. The guard showed him his cell. He sat on the edge of the bed. He put his hands on his knees. He had 58 years to think about everything. The liquidation of the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department's 14th precinct purpose prines took 8 months to complete. The federal court ordered the full dissolution of the unit and the reallocation of its assets, including the building, the equipment, the pension fund reserves of the officers found complicit in Harrison's operations, and the funds recovered from the civil restitution proceedings against Harrison's estate. The 12 officers who had been present during the booking of Isaiah Perkins and had taken no action were each subject to individual federal review. 4 of them, including Sergeant Donovan Miller, received suspensions pending investigation. Miller retired before his hearing, submitting his papers on a Tuesday morning without ceremony. He cleaned out his desk in 20 minutes. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He drove home, sat in his driveway for a long time, and thought about 22 years of choosing the path of least resistance, and what the accumulated cost of that choice looked like when it was spread out in front of you all at once. 2 of the other officers left the force voluntarily. 1 was reassigned. Danny Dunning received a commendation. It was presented quietly without fanfare, at a small ceremony that the department's new oversight board organized. He accepted it without making a speech. He went home and called his father, the firefighter, and told him about it. His father said, "That's exactly right, son. That's exactly what it's supposed to mean." The building on Granger Avenue was renovated. This took 5 months. The brick facade was kept. Some of the contractors argued for tearing it down entirely, but the Community Advisory Board decided that what the building needed was not destruction, but transformation. A new sign was designed. New doors were installed. The interior was gutted and rebuilt from the floor up. The basketball courts went in last. Isaiah stood at the ribbon on a Saturday morning in late autumn, 6 months after the verdict, on a day that was cold and bright and clear. Nothing like the rain of Route 9 on that Tuesday evening that had started all of this. He was wearing a suit jacket over a simple shirt, which for a man whose default uniform is a gray t-shirt, represented a considered sartorial choice. The Community Advisory Board had asked him to say a few words. He had thought about this for a while. Isaiah was not a man who spoke at length about himself or about what he had done. 12 years as a Navy SEAL and several more in federal service had trained a deep aversion to the kind of self-congratulation that most public moments seem to require. But he had agreed to speak because this was not about him. The sign above the new doors read, Tathan, Cale Community Center. Ethan Cole had been 19 years old when Harrison stopped him on a Tuesday night in 2014. He had been on his way home from a dishwashing shift at a restaurant on the east side of Millhaven, still wearing the same non-slip shoes he wore every shift, carrying a backpack that contained a notebook, a library book he had checked out 3 days earlier, and $17 in tip money. He had done nothing wrong. He had been walking on a public street. Harrison had stopped him, searched him, found nothing, and then charged him anyway. The felony possession charge was built on a small bag of a controlled substance that Ethan Cole had never seen before the moment Harrison held it up. The real investigation, 11 years later, would establish this conclusively. But in 2014, Ethan Cole was 19 years old, and he did not have the resources for the kind of defense that could fight a planted evidence charge. And the court-appointed attorney assigned to his case had 17 other active cases, and not enough hours in the day. He served 18 months. He had come out of those 18 months changed in the specific, irreversible way that institutional damage operates on the young. Not broken, exactly, but altered. He had gone in as a 19-year-old with a dishwashing job and a library card, and the ordinary forward-looking energy of a person whose life was still mostly ahead of them. He came out as someone who had learned at a very foundational level that the systems that were supposed to protect him had decided that the category of person he belonged to was not the category that the system protected. That's a lesson that, once learned, does not unlearn itself easily. He spent the next 7 years trying. He really did try. He got jobs. Lost them when background checks surfaced, the felony. Got other jobs. Built something slowly and carefully and with enormous effort. He had people who loved him. A grandmother on Prospect Street who kept his photograph on her mantle. 2 cousins who drove him to job interviews when he couldn't afford the bus. He had not given up. It matters to say that. He had not given up. He died in 2021 at 26 years old, never knowing that the charge that had altered the trajectory of his entire life had been constructed by a man who kept its proceeds in a storage unit on Route 14 and slept well every night. The investigation found his name in the files. It found the documentation of the planted evidence. It found the paperwork trail. It found 33 others like him. The community center was named for Ethan Cole because he was 26 years old and never knew that the system had failed him completely, and because the adults in that system who might have protected him had chosen, over and over again, the path of least resistance. Isaiah stood at the ribbon on a Saturday morning in late autumn, 6 months after the verdict, on a day that was cold and bright and clear. Nothing like the rain of Route 9 on that Tuesday evening that had started all of this. He was wearing a suit jacket over a simple shirt, which for a man whose default uniform is a gray t-shirt represented a considered sartorial choice. The woman from the Silver Accord was there. Her name was Carol Ingram. She had required surgery. The 11-minute gap in cervical stabilization that Harrison's taser had caused had worsened her injury, in ways that surgeons had addressed over 2 procedures. She walked with a cane now, and probably would for the rest of her life. But she was walking. She had told Isaiah, in a letter she sent 6 weeks after the trial, that the medical team had been very clear if he had released her neck when Harrison first ordered him to, she would not be walking at all. She was standing near the front of the small crowd. When Isaiah saw her, he nodded. She nodded back. Isaiah looked out at the ribbon, at the building, at the people gathered, families, community members, 2 of Ethan Cole's cousins who had come from 3 states away, Officer Danny Dunning, who was standing near the back with his hands in his pockets and his eyes clear. The children were already looking at the basketball courts. Isaiah spoke briefly. He said that a community is only as strong as its willingness to protect the people inside it. He said that protection is not the same as force. He said that the men and women who wear badges carry something that belongs to the public, not to themselves, and that the difference between a guardian and a predator is not the uniform but the understanding of what the uniform means. He paused. He looked at the building. A badge, he said, is a shield for the public, not a sword for the wearer. He let that sit for a moment. And karma always hits with the precision of a sniper's bullet. He cut the ribbon. The doors opened. The children ran toward the basketball courts. A woman at a table inside was already helping someone fill out a job application. A paramedics trainer was arranging equipment for the free certification class that would start at noon, the class that would teach people exactly the skills that Isaiah Perkins had used on a rainy Tuesday evening on Route 9 to keep a woman with a spinal injury alive long enough for help to arrive. Isaiah stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked at the trident on the challenge coin in his palm. The one he had carried for 11 years. The one that had been kicked into the mud and recovered by a young officer who had made the right choice when it mattered. He held it for a moment. Then he put it back in his pocket. He walked inside. Carol Ingram followed. She looked up at the name one last time, Tafren Co. Community Center. And she looked at the children already mid-game on the court. And something in her expression settled. Dunning, near the back of the crowd, watched the doors. He stayed until the last of the crowd had filtered inside. Then he turned off his collar against the autumn cold and walked to his car. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. 8 months ago, he had run a set of fingerprints because it was procedure. Because that was what you did. He had not known, in that moment, that it would be the most important thing he had done or would do in his career. He had not been trying to be a hero. He had just been trying to do his job the way it was supposed to be done. Maybe that was the whole thing, he thought. Maybe it was that simple. Maybe the difference between a department like this one, this new one, this rebuilt one, with its open doors and its certification classes and the name of a 26-year-old above the entrance, and the one it had replaced, was simply the accumulated weight of 100 small choices to do the job the way it was supposed to be done. He started the engine. Behind him, the doors of the Ethan Cole Community Center stayed open.